This is the second part of a two-part series, so if you haven't listened to episode 123, pause this here, go back and listen to part 1, so you will be up to speed for this part. We left off discussing the 2001 murder of 27-year-old expectant mother Crystal Taylor, and how it appeared as though investigators were close to solving her case. They had a pretty good idea who the trigger person was, but everyone was pretty sure that there was more to the story. They had their suspect in custody, but he wasn't talking, at least not about Crystal. In order to divert the investigation into her murder away from him, the suspected gunman threw a monkey wrench into the entire case and confessed to a completely different murder. Without any useful information coming from him regarding Crystal's murder, the district attorney left feeling they simply didn't have a strong enough case to place him at the scene, dropped the charges against him in Crystal's case. They went ahead and charged their suspect with the other murder that he implicated himself in, and decided to wait and see if they would be able to uncover anything in Crystal's murder that would help solidify their case. And we will pick up our story from there. "2001 slowly bled into 2002. The country and the world was still reeling from the terrorist attacks that took place exactly 2 Tuesdays before Crystal's death. Momo passed away in March of 2002. Failing health, yes, but then compounded by the grief and heartbreak after having lost her youngest child. And then in May, 9 months pregnant single mom Evelyn Hernandez vanished, along with her 5-year-old son. Yet the media barely batted an eye. And then the Taylor family got hit by the Laci Peterson effect. Almost exactly 15 months to the day that Crystal was killed, the media went batshit crazy over the very pretty, very pregnant missing suburban wife, also 27 years old. Yet Crystal's story had never made any kind of a splash in the media up to that point. It was heartbreaking for her sisters to feel Crystal's worth was less than Laci's, simply because of the color of her skin or the details of the circumstances in her life. All of it was too much. To see the world that kept moving on and moving forward to the next headline in the news. It was almost more than Crystal's sisters could bear to watch happening. And because the sadness and the stress had taken its toll on the once close-knit family, being around each other seemed to elicit nothing but more pain and anguish. So they started to avoid one another, because being around each other just hurt way too much. This is what families mean when they describe a death like this having destroyed their family. Crystal's murder completely devastated the Taylor family. Meanwhile, Skylar Moore was convicted of the murder that he had confessed to when he was brought in for questioning about Crystal's murder. But despite the fact that they knew Moore had killed Crystal, that he was the one who fired the bullet into the back of her head, that still didn't bring them any peace, knowing that her case would languish in the Hawthorne Police Department's pile of cold cases. Because the one thing that bothered Crystal's family the most was this. Skylar Moore did not know Crystal. He did not have any reason to kill her. He didn't rob her. He didn't rape her. He just shot her in the back of the head and ran. To them, it sounded like he did the killing for someone else, and they had their suspicions as to who it was that wanted Crystal dead. The only hope of ever figuring out the reason why Crystal was murdered was for her sisters to keep her death as their priority. Even when others around them and in their lives were kind of telling them, you all are still stuck on that, maybe it's time to let go and move forward. But there just wasn't going to be any moving forward. Moving forward and on to what? It's still not going to help them get past the questions that they needed answers to. Their minds, their thoughts, their memories, their every waking minute, and every moment in between was completely consumed with the weeks, days, hours, and minutes leading up to Crystal's violent murder. The answers are often hidden in those minuscule flashes of the past. We just have to will ourselves to be able to travel back in our minds and remember them. They were right there in front of our faces. We just didn't know what it all meant at the time. Crystal's sisters' minds went back to the trip from Texas after they had spent 2 weeks visiting their mom. They had left on the day of the terrorist attacks, September 11th, 2001. They arrived back in Hawthorne late on Saturday night, the 22nd, into the early morning of Sunday, the 23rd. And they all remembered thinking that we're going to go to sleep, we're going to sleep in the next day, and we're just going to relax and recover. We're just back from this trip halfway across the country. We all got to go back to work on Monday. Let's have Sunday to recoup. But Crystal, she wanted to go to church. She was up early, and her niece was there, watching her as she prayed. And soon she saw Crystal begin to quietly cry. It was clear to her family that something pretty serious was going on with her. She wasn't being open with them as to exactly what it was, and they didn't push. It was the following morning that Michelle saw that man sitting on the stairs in the lobby of their apartment complex that later turned out to be Skylar Moore. She called up to Crystal and told her about him, and Crystal made the decision to take the long way down towards the parking area from another direction. It was a move that may have spared her from meeting with that gunman waiting for her downstairs for at least one day. And she went to work per usual. But something else happened at work that day. And it was something her sisters really didn't find out about until sometime later. They were told by some of her coworkers that on Monday, Crystal did leave work early. She had experienced a breakdown. She was sobbing and in tears in the bathroom, so much so that she left early. But that evening, when everyone was home, Crystal still did not indicate to anyone in her family that something was terribly wrong. She had kept it to herself, but her sisters, they knew her. They felt that something wasn't quite right. She seemed particularly emotional towards them. She hugged them and she told them that she loved them. She still didn't explain what was going on with her. But the truth was, Crystal was the kind of person who simply did not want any of her problems or her stress to bring her family down, or for them to feel like that they needed to help carry the weight of her burdens. So Crystal's family kept searching their memories. What was going on with Crystal? What was causing her so much emotional distress up until the last night of her life? And finally, it was like a light that had suddenly flashed, and their thoughts took them back to something that Crystal had said to her family at some point during that long car ride back from Texas. They said Crystal was quiet, listening to something on her phone. From the sounds of how they described it, I think she may have been listening to a voicemail message, but it could have also been someone talking to her on the other line. Either way, Crystal was quiet, listening intently. And then she put her phone down, and she turned to her family and she said something ominous. "If something happens to me, it was Derek." But again, her sisters didn't pry. They didn't ask too many questions. And there wasn't anything Crystal had said that set off any red flags for them in the moment. Because when she said that, she just moved really quickly past it and told her family that Derek Smyers was not going to be an active participant in her baby's life. So the family thought, okay, that is a tough situation to be in, but they've been through it before. They'll get through it again. Derek not being in the baby's life is fine. They will handle it together. But now, all this time later, trying to sort through the details of her murder, looking for reasons why this all happened, they had thought back to when Crystal had said those words, "If something happens to me." They wished they had asked more questions, but they didn't. They just rallied their support. This baby had all of them. Forget Derek. He's just like whatever. We don't need him. They had come to the heartbreaking realization that Crystal had hinted that something might happen, that she was worried about something, but they just didn't pick up on it. But you can't go back in time. You can only look ahead and hope that there is some way to reconcile all of this. But one thing was clear. Derek Smyer was up to this to his eyeballs. And so time wore on. Days and months and years would go by. They thought about those words that Crystal had said on that trip back from Texas. "If something happens to me, it was Derek." So unwilling to let that go, pseudo-investigators, sisters Michelle and Monica, similar to how they managed to track down Skylar Moore, they started to try to track down Derek Smyer. Unfortunately, for much of that time that they were looking for him, they were looking for Derek Meyer. So that was a major waste of time. Eventually, Crystal's niece did spot him one afternoon, still driving that Mustang, his whip, and seeing him in his convertible with his top down on a beautiful day, just living his life. It filled Crystal's niece with so many emotions as to how unfair all of this was. And another person who never forgot about Crystal's case was Detective Williams. As his career flourished and he moved up the ranks within the Hawthorne Police Department, he made sure that Crystal's case file came with him. He was pretty sure that Derek Smyer was involved in Crystal's murder. He just simply did not have anything in the way of evidence to prove it. He's got Skylar Moore, who he is sure is the trigger person, sitting in prison for the rest of his life, convicted of another unrelated murder, but still did not have even enough on him to hold him accountable for Crystal's murder. All Detective Williams could do was keep Crystal's file close and see what time could do to someone sitting in jail just waiting to die. And 10 years would pass. The one thing Detective Williams was never able to establish was a connection between Skylar Moore and Derek Smyer. But as he had the time to reflect back on the case himself, something lit up in his far distant memories also. On the day that Crystal was killed, September 25th, 2001, Detective Williams had spoken to Crystal's co-worker, and they first brought about the information that Crystal was pregnant and the name of the father was Derek Smyer. The co-workers had gone with the detective over to Anderson Park, where they knew Crystal and Derek had met. And that was the first time Detective Williams saw Derek Smyer, and he was hanging out there with a group of people. At the time, that first day of the investigation, The gunman, Skylar Moore, had not even been mentioned yet as having been possibly involved. His name wouldn't come up for a couple of months. Thinking back on that group that Derek Smyer was with at the park, Detective Williams was fairly certain that one of the individuals in that group was Skylar Moore. And if that was in fact him, then that put the two of them together just mere hours after Crystal was gunned down. But now, a decade later, how do you go back and prove that? Well, a lot of the time, it's just sheer luck. And sometimes that luck comes in the form of an officer or an investigator that also never quite forgot the case that didn't get solved. For Los Angeles Sheriff's Detectives Beth Smith, her unforgotten case was Crystal's. Detective Smith was part of the original investigation into Crystal's murder. She never forgot any of the people involved, including Derek Smyer and Skylar Moore. Moore was sitting in a prison someplace in Northern California for that other murder, but he definitely crossed Detective Smith's mind every now and again. And well, it just so happened that she and fellow Sheriff Detective Richard Lopez were up in the area on some unrelated cases, and Detective Smith remembered that Skylar Moore was nearby. The two of them had a little bit of time on their hands before they needed to get to the airport to catch their flight back down to Southern California, so she thought maybe, just maybe, they can stop in and have a little chat with Skylar Moore. And Detective Lopez was like, yeah, let's do it. So they went up to the prison and asked him to be brought out so they could speak to him. And they recorded the conversation. When Detective Smith first brought up the arrest from 10 years earlier, when he was brought into custody, and even went through a preliminary hearing in Crystal's case, Skylar Moore at first seemed to not remember. Detective Lopez had had a lot of experience interrogating gang members, and he could tell that Moore was not having an easy go of it in prison. He had made a lot of enemies, and he was pretty much confined to solitary for his own safety. He was doing some hard time, and he was young, so he had a long ways to go. And I even looked him up today, some 18 years after all of this happened, and the guy is only 38 years old now. So he was 20 when he got caught up in all this. Well, Lopez told him, here's the deal. Maybe, just maybe, no promises. If you can help us, if you can provide us with some useful and truthful information, he would look into getting him moved out of state, someplace where he wasn't known, someplace where he could serve time in the general population and have an easier go at it. Detective Lopez also made it clear to Moore that they weren't there to cause him to catch another case, and they reminded him that they didn't even Mirandize him when they started talking, so whatever he tells them can't be used against him in court. They just wanted to finally get down to the actual truth. He brought up some pictures of Crystal and Derek Smyer, and he showed them to him, hopefully to jog his memory or maybe even jog his conscience. The detective just had to get through Moore's hang-up when it comes to talking to police. And Detective Lopez also knows that guys like Moore hang on to a lot. And over the years, it wears on them. And if he could just get Moore to let his guard down, little by little, it would all come flowing out of him. And eventually, it did. Yeah, that was him that used to hang out at Anderson Park with Derek Smyer. They met playing pickup games of basketball. And I want to just say here that Derek's sister, Danielle, his staunch defender, I'll talk more about her in a little bit. She's going to say later on that Derek hasn't touched a basketball since high school. Now, I don't know what it's like where you guys live, but I can almost guarantee that at every park in Southern California, there's always a group of guys that are willing and able and wanting to get together for a game of pickup basketball. Happens all the time, even out of nowhere. So these guys are regulars at the park, and you're going to tell me that Derek never plays basketball? When she had said earlier, when they were being brought up, that they played every single sport under the sun, and later on, the prosecutors would bring up pictures of Derek in high school in a basketball uniform. So, I don't know. It just seems like another way that Danielle is trying everything she can to distance Derek from these guys at the park. But anyway, Moore says that they met playing pickup games of basketball. Why he would lie about that, I have no idea. And this was the same park where Derek Smyer had met Crystal. And it was during the summer of 2001 that Smyer started confiding in him that he was having a problem. And that problem was named Crystal Taylor. He accused her of pinning a pregnancy on him because he had money, that she was looking for a sugar daddy, and that she was going to be after him over this kid. Smyer needed to get rid of her so he could get rid of 18 years of financial obligation to her and this child. Eventually, the two men came to terms. Moore would handle the problem for him, and in return, all he wanted from Smyer was a favor, so to speak. But in one of the oddest aspects of all of this, there would be no money involved. Later on, this gets explained out a little bit better, but for now, that's a big, huge issue for the case. That not only was there no money involved, Moore didn't even want any money from him. And I'm sure that suited a man like Derek Smyer's stingy ass perfectly fine. All Moore wanted from Smyer in return was his loyalty. I'll do this for you, and Smyer, you will be indebted to me. Whatever that meant in Moore's mind. I guess in Moore's world of street gangs and crimes, that means something more valuable than money, at least to him anyway. And with that, Moore told detectives Lopez and Smith that yeah, it was him. That was him the morning before, sitting on the stairs having been confronted by Crystal's sister. He was planning on doing it that morning, but the sister had tipped Crystal off and Crystal took a different route to her car and sidestepped his attempt on her life. Then he showed back up the next morning, waited for Crystal again to come down the stairs, and when she did, he approached her from behind and shot her in the back of the head with a .38 caliber handgun, and then he fled the scene. And there it was. After 10 years of searching for the truth, it all came out in a visiting room in a Northern California prison. So we might be asking, why now? Why is Skylar Moore suddenly moved to fess up to this crime seemingly out of the blue? For the detectives, whether we wanted to believe this is the truth or not, they believe that this was a killing that Skylar Moore actually regretted. That he had had a great deal of remorse for having killed a pregnant woman, as it apparently went against everything that he stood for, even as an already convicted murderer. Whatever other killings Moore had been involved in, those were all part of his life of crime, being involved in gangs. Killing Crystal was a disgraceful act, and it weighed heavily on him. Now, how all of you listening want to take that is up to you. We can talk about it in the discussion group, and it's not that I don't believe in what he's saying, but he had the choice at the time to not do this killing. When Derek Smyer solicited his help, he could have said no. And if it's such a shameful thing to murder a pregnant woman, what kind of person does that make Derek Smyer? If it goes against Moore's own moral code to commit this kind of killing, doesn't the same standard go for Derek Smyer? So why would Moore want a guy like him to be beholden to him for doing this crime? This whole thing, this whole philosophy these people seem to abide by is so weird to me anyway. I mean, I get not killing children, not killing babies, not killing pregnant women. Murderers even have standards too, right? But Moore did it anyway, despite claiming to live that life. He suspended his own beliefs and went ahead with the killing. So his regret, this remorse, even if he genuinely felt it, it's too little too late. The stand-up thing to do would have been to tell Derek Smyer to step up and do the right thing, and the right thing being to not only not kill Crystal, but also handle his responsibilities. But it didn't happen that way. For whatever reason, Moore did this killing at the behest of Smyer. And so the truth had finally come to the surface, 10 years after Crystal and her unborn baby were killed in cold blood. So the detectives needed to talk to Crystal's sisters with this new break in the case. It had been 10 years, and they may not have been as consumed with the case as they had been. It was far from being forgotten. They still wanted answers because they always knew that there was more to the story. And even though the man they believed pulled the trigger on the gun that fired the bullet into Crystal's head was in prison and was never going to get out, it was still hollow. Crystal's case was still technically unsolved. They knew Skylar carried with him the key that would unlock all of the unanswered questions that they had been obsessing over for a decade. The detectives told Crystal's sisters. The shooter admitted that he killed Crystal at the request of Derek Smyer. It was also the first time that Michelle had heard that her vivid memory of encountering Moore on the stairs the morning before Crystal was killed was just as vivid of a memory for him, as he initially thought that she was actually Crystal, and he almost killed her right there on the spot. She had come that close to being mistakenly murdered. And now the task at hand was going to be this. Moore's confession was given off the record. They were not going to be able to use it in court, so they needed to find another way to start building the case against Smyer. And the sisters were ready to reopen their own unofficial investigation into him too. And that's when they found out that they had his name wrong all those years. They began trying to find out all they could about Smyer on their own as the police worked their investigation on their end. They found out where he was working. They found out where he lived. They stopped short of full-on stalking the guy, but they wanted to make sure that this time around that they got it right and that the police were covering all of the bases. As for Detective Lopez's part, he resurrected Crystal's case file from the endless piles of cold and unsolved cases and went over every single page of the initial investigation. And well, as he went along, everything was pretty much a mirror image of the information Skylar Moore had provided in that interview at the prison. So he made a bold move and decided to roll the dice and arrest Smyer for Crystal's murder. Just 2 months shy of the 10th anniversary of her death. He was taken in for questioning for a second time about Crystal and his role in it. And he was just as arrogant as he'd ever been. He did what he could to command the interview, to steer it in the direction that he wanted it to go. But Detective Lopez was not there to play games. He was like, look, your friend, Skylar Moore, better known on the streets as C. Styles, he rolled over on you. He told us everything. But Smyer kept up his denial, and whatever pressure the detectives were putting on him, he wasn't really fazed. He was cool, calm, and collected, start to finish. But was it because he was actually innocent? Or was it because he was that cold and manipulative? If you want my answer, I'm going to go with cold and manipulative. But at the end of the day, when you break down the motive, when you take a look at who had the most to gain from Crystal's death, it all comes down to one person, Derek Smyer. He had 18 years of unwanted financial obligations looming, and that is a huge motive. I want to talk a little bit about Derek Smyer's sister, Danielle. She's been outspoken about her brother, and she's quite a little pistol, that girl. I know she's going to defend her brother to the death because she wants to believe in his innocence in all of this. And trust me, dreamers, we are going to get into more information in Derek Smyer's background, and it paints a pretty ugly picture of this guy, if he already isn't looking ugly as it is. But his sister, wow. She seems really sweet, really smart. She's really pretty, but I can't help but feel like she's living in some sort of alternative reality where she sees her brother as the perfect man who would not, could not, never would, ever could do a thing that he is being accused of. Like, it is so ridiculous and absurd that anyone could even think that he would have anything to do with Crystal's murder, that he would associate with people the likes of Skylar Moore. Anyone who thinks that is completely insane. They were not raised this way. They were from a good family, a good background. They were never around any kind of gang activity, nor would either one of them have anything to do with anyone or anybody like this. Based on what she had to say about herself, her brother, and her family, they had the complete, total, perfect, idyllic upbringing with very active, very present, very much involved in every aspect of their lives growing up. 2 parents, they were both involved in a plethora of extracurricular activities. They played every sport, every league, and their parents were involved in everything through their entire childhood. But as much as Danielle Smyer wants to push that narrative, she can't just simply excuse away her brother's transgressions early on in life. Like when he became a father for the first time at the age of 16, and that their parents were very, very disappointed when Smyer broke the news to them that he was going to be a dad. And according to Danielle, her parents are traditionalists to the core. You don't have children unless you're married. That's what her parents did. That's what was expected of them. So this was not welcome news at all. So according to Danielle, when his daughter was born in 1998, Smyer dropped out of high school. He started working full time. According to her, her brother stepped up. He took his responsibilities as a father very seriously, and he did everything in his power to support this child through and through. Okay. So, a year after Crystal was murdered, Smyer had another child with the same mother as the first. Her name is Tracy, and we'll talk more about her later. And again, Smyer's sister is selling her brother to us as being very present in the lives of his children. But you can't help but notice that whenever this girl says something about her brother, there always feels like there's an asterisk next to every sentence. Like, we were raised perfectly by perfect parents. We were perfect children. Asterisk. But my brother went and knocked up his girlfriend and became a dad at 16. But never mind that, he's still a perfect kid. He just made this one big, huge mistake that was the utter disappointment of our entire family. Okay. And then he has a second child in 2002. And she says he was very active in their lives. And she even showed a video of him trying to rollerblade with his oldest daughter. But there's another asterisk, as Danielle is forced to admit, yeah, but he's hardly as much of a presence as a full-time dad, but he's still around. See, here's him rollerblading this one time. Danielle said that he was there. They all were. They embraced his 2 children. There was no way this man, this loving, doting father, would ever order a hit on Crystal because of her pregnancy. And then here comes another asterisk. If he was even really truly the father. Because according to Danielle, she never heard the name Crystal Taylor until her brother was arrested in 2011. He never mentioned he was seeing anybody named Crystal Taylor. And of course, he never mentioned any concern over any girl that he got pregnant. And this next statement from her came when she was asked directly, did your brother associate with a guy named C. Stiles? She insisted, never brought him up, never talked about him. Again, her parents are extremely traditional people. Nobody in their family ever had anything to do with any gang violence, any gang activity. They would have none of it. As for her brother, he would never bring anyone associated with gangs to their home, nor would he ever affiliate with any such types of people. Furthermore, nobody has ever seen her brother in the company of any types of street gang members. And of course, her brother had absolutely nothing to do with Crystal Taylor's murder. So why would Skylar Moore implicate her perfect brother in this horrific crime? Of course, Danielle Smyer has the answers at the ready. Skylar Moore is a thug who has unfortunately earned himself as a reputation in prison as a snitch, so the police approached him with a deal. Help us nail Derek Smyer for this murder, and we'll send you off to a prison where you can live more comfortably. And why would the police want to railroad an innocent man? Why her brother? Well, she'll kick this answer off with an asterisk. Her brother is far from a perfect man. Oh, really? Sounds like that's what you've been saying up to this point, but okay, go on. She says her brother was an easy target, and he was nothing more than another victim of police harassment, and all of this was a frame-up. Personally, I don't think Derek Smyer was an easy target for police. If it were that simple, he'd have been in prison 10 years earlier for this. It wasn't that cut and dry. But the investigation early on, based on stories that were corroborated by several people close to Crystal at the time, including her co-workers, who did identify themselves as close friends of hers and her sisters. All of them were aware that Crystal was having an issue with Smyer, the man that she said was the father of her unborn baby. Police didn't just pull Smyer's name out of the blue. Their initial investigation led to him. And dreamers, I'm sorry if I'm coming off as kind of callous and judgy when it comes to his sister, Danielle. I know that she loves her brother, and she really wants to believe in and fight for his innocence. But listening to her talk about him and defend him is like talking to a used car salesperson. Listening to her describe how perfect they were, except for this one thing that Derek did, and how much of a great dad that he is, except he's not completely in his children's lives, like, say, a traditional father would be. I mean, they were raised that way, right? Right. My impression of Derek Smyer is very much in stark contrast to what his sister is attempting to sell here. And yes, she knows him. I do not know him personally. But the difference is I'm willing to look at the whole picture of who Derek Smyer is as a man and as a father, and to me, he stinks. The things that resulted from Smyer's so-called perfect upbringing are clear. Despite getting sidetracked at the age of 16 by fatherhood, he still ended up going to college and he earned his degree in business and making a pretty good living for himself. There is no doubt his ability and his ambition to succeed in life is rooted in his upbringing. But there is another side to Derek Smyer, the side of him that no matter how much his family wants to shove the traditional family narrative down our throats, that simply was not the cloth that Smyer was cut from. Derek Smyer is not his father. No matter how well their parents raised them, Derek Smyer was going to be his own man, he was going to take his own path, and he was not going to follow the traditions his parents had hoped that he would. And there simply is no getting around that. Smyer was raised with all the possibilities life had to offer right there in front of him for the taking. But therein lies the problem. Derek Smyer became a taker. We got the impression about him early on that he was very much into himself, he was very much into his Mustang, and into being a player when it came to women, and he wasn't even trying to be safe or careful about it. At the age of 16, his girlfriend got pregnant. I can't say for sure because nothing is foolproof, but chances are they were having unprotected sex. And then, just a couple of years later, he gets involved in a casual sexual relationship with Crystal, and in a month's time, she's pregnant. And she tells Smyer that he's the dad, and it didn't seem like he really protested it all that much. There were no reports that he was trying to deny that the baby was his. He may have, angrily or off the cuff, but he was pretty much accepting that this was his. And eventually he arrived at the conclusion that since Crystal was not going to terminate the pregnancy, the answer to his problems was going to be to get rid of the problem himself. If Smyer doubted that the baby was his, I don't think he would be so quick to jump to murder as the solution. And because he seemed convinced that he was the dad, that again leads me to believe that he engaged in unprotected sex with Crystal. So, this gives me the impression that Derek Smyer is a guy that is very much all about what works best for him in the moment. He wants to have sex. He doesn't want to protect himself or his partner. He doesn't care if problems arise. He will cross that bridge when he gets to it. Instead of doing the right thing, he will choose to do the thing that is most convenient for him, even if the consequence is an 18-year commitment. Derek Smyer was never going to be the traditionalist that his father was. He was never going to be out there looking for his one and only true love, his soulmate. He was never going to court her. He was never going to ask her father's permission to have her hand in marriage. And he obviously wasn't going to wait until he was married to consummate his relationships. He wasn't going to be the family man. He wasn't going to be that 9-to-5 husband and dad. He wasn't going to come home to the picket fence around the perfectly manicured yard, kids waiting for him to come through the door. Derek Smyer was a man who wanted what he wanted when he wanted it, and when he was done with it, he'd toss it aside and move on to the next. Everyone believed that this is what he did to Crystal, that she became a problem for him, so he had her dispatched. Everyone believed it. The police, her friends, her family, and I believe it too. But were police going to be able to prove it? That remains to be seen, right? Because not long after Detective Lopez arrested Smyer in 2011 for Crystal's murder, he had to let him go. He was hoping to corner him with the information that he got from Skylar Moore, but it didn't work. So again, for a second time, Smyer was free to go. It was a difficult decision for the detectives on this case, and it was a painful one for Crystal's family to see him given another chance to go on about his life without a care in the world, knowing deep in their hearts that he was the one who robbed them of having Crystal in their lives and in this world. So Derek Smyer was let go, as he continued to insist that he would never order a hit just because he got someone pregnant. He had 2 children of his own. He touted himself as a loving, devoted dad. The evidence just wasn't quite there yet. The pressure that detectives applied using the information that Moore had provided them from jail didn't cause not a single crack in this man's facade. But just because they had to let Smyer off the hook for now, it did mean that they were going to stop looking for something, anything, to pin him for this crime. Then suddenly investigators got yet another tantalizing lead in this case. And it was nothing short of stunning when they received this information. And if anyone associated with the case even had a bit of uncertainty that Smyer was the one who commissioned Crystal's murder, this new evidence all but eliminated any lingering doubts. Investigators had a conversation with Tracy. I mentioned her briefly. She is the mother of Derek Smyer's children, the children who survived their pregnancies. And if you think that's a joke, it's not. In the beginning, when Crystal's murder was first being investigated, Tracy dodged speaking to police about any of this. But now, some 10 years after the fact, she was ready to talk. And she had something very interesting to tell investigators about an incident that happened when she was pregnant back in 1998 with Smyer's first child. She had been expecting Smyer to come to her place to pick her up, as he said that he was going to accompany her to her doctor's appointment. He said he would pick her up in the alleyway behind her home. So when she went out there, waiting for him, she was suddenly attacked by an unknown assailant who delivered a cut to her throat. She was taken to the hospital where she would recover from her injuries, and she did go on to give birth to a healthy baby girl a couple months later. Remember, Derek Smyer was only 16 years old at that time. Tracy was very, very suspicious of him for a number of reasons. For starters, prior to that day, he had never wanted to go to the doctor with her, nor did he ever offer to give her a ride. This was the first time. Also, instead of picking her up in front of the house, which is where all her visitors would come to pull up to come into the house or to pick anyone up, Smyer instructed her to go around to the back alley, which obviously was much more shrouded and obscured from public view and prying eyes. And dreamers, this was not the only time that Tracy was assaulted while she was pregnant. Remember I mentioned before that a year after Crystal's murder, Tracy became pregnant again by Derek Smyer a second time. And well, guess what? She was attacked during that pregnancy as well. Someone had accosted her, punched her in the face, pushed her down onto the ground, and proceeded to deliver several kicks to her abdomen and to her head. Again, she recovered, the baby survived, and she gave birth to Smyer's second child a short time later. Both of those attacks on Tracy went unsolved. Nobody was ever convicted of anything. But she was 100% convinced that Derek Smyer was responsible for setting both of those attacks up. And the reason, she said, was because it was obvious that he didn't want her to have these children. Throughout both pregnancies, Smyer insisted that she terminate them, but she didn't want to do that. And she believed these were 2 failed attempts on his part to have either her or her unborn child killed to prevent him from having to be held responsible for paying child support payments. In situations like this, a lot of times the question that always comes up is why, after Tracy was attacked the first time in 1998, had her throat cut, and suspected that Smyer was behind it, why would she end up back with him 4 years later and become pregnant with yet another child? And you know, Crystal happened in between her 2 pregnancies. There is no question that she had at least some knowledge of what happened to Crystal. and that Smyer was being looked at as a possible suspect in the murder of a woman pregnant with his child because we know she avoided talking to police about it. They tried to reach out to her. They told her, hey, your baby's dad is in this deep with this young woman's murder. But she stayed quiet and she tried to dodge them. And you really can't blame her. And we can't blame her for going back to this man again. As much as anyone who knew her would have probably grabbed her and said, are you insane? You are going back with this guy again? After he tried to have you killed? Are you out of your mind? Women and men stay with abusive, intimate partners all the time, and the reasons they do so are only theirs to know and understand. They stay out of fear or dependence or love. Detective Lopez would say that Tracy went back to Smyer because he's a manipulator and he is masterful at it. And I mentioned that too. That was my early impression of him. What is it about Smyer that enables him to be so manipulative? Is he all that charming? Perhaps. Is he that great of a catch? Meh, I guess. It's up to you to judge. But all the nice and good-looking things on the outside hardly makes up for all the wretched ugliness on the inside, of which there seems to be no shortage of, but okay. He drives a nice car. Ugh, that's not impressive if the person behind the wheel is a dick with a vanity plate that says my whip, but okay. He has a good job and he makes good money. But that's still not always the makings of a good man. All this junk about Smyer, he's a charmer, he's debatably okay looking, he's got a nice ride and money in the bank. Ladies, you know all that stuff is surface level when it comes to men like Derek Smyer. It is a very, very thin veneer. And if you look just closely enough, you quite easily see right through it. Smyer is a big fat faker, and he uses the things and people in his life, his car, his job, even his nice family and his lovely sister. Everything around him is a prop in the Derek Smyer show. So how are we feeling about Mr. Derek Smyer up to this point? Not thinking too highly of him, I would assume? Well, if he already hasn't impressed you with his outrageous arrogance, manipulative ways, and horrific treatment of women and his own children, well, then it's about to get worse. You see, not only are investigators beginning to see a pattern of behavior here when it comes to Smyer and the women in his life, they found another interesting bit of information about him. And it was somewhat interesting, but not all that surprising, that Derek Smyer did, in fact, serve time in federal prison. Oh, really? I wonder if Derek's sister and his perfectly traditional parents knew about this. Or did he tell them that he was going on an extended vacation, or that he was out of state for work for a while? I'm sorry if I seem like I'm picking on his sister. She seems like a truly genuine, lovely person who loves her family and loves her brother. But all the love in the world should not cause you to go blind to the things that are going on right in front of your face. As a member of his family, you have really got to stop and ask yourself, is Derek Smyer the kind of man that I'd like my daughter to bring home? Would Danielle Smyer herself become involved with a man who exhibited the same types of troubling behaviors that her brother has? Would her parents approve of her being involved with someone like their own son? If they were willing to see the truth, I highly doubt it. So, federal prison. What in the world did Derek Smyer do this time? Well, not surprisingly, it involved him using and manipulating yet another girlfriend. He was convicted of charges related to several incidents of bank fraud in 2004. He was running this scam that involved him stealing money from the accounts of several customers at the bank. His girlfriend at the time, she worked at a bank and she was providing him with customer bank account numbers. And he used those account numbers to funnel money out of those accounts into accounts that he owned. In total, Derek Smyer stole about $80,000, and it was money that investigators were never really able to recover. They were never able to figure out what Smyer did with the money. Let me pause here and talk a little bit more about this bank fraud conviction. The woman involved with Smyer at the time, who worked at the bank, was only identified in court documents as RV. She began dating Smyer after his relationship with his children's mom, Tracy, had ended. She would later be called to provide testimony about her relationship with Smyer, at which time she indicated that both of them were convicted in the bank fraud scheme. But she also provided some details about Smyer that were, surprise, surprise, unflattering. Imagine that. RV said that she worked at a credit union, and at the same time, Smyer was working at Wells Fargo. And during that time, they were dating. She said that she was convicted of the bank fraud in federal court and was required to jointly pay back $80,000, but she denied taking the money. But she said that she told Smyer about how the credit union operated, though she was limited as to how much she was able to testify as to Smyer's role in the fraud. RV was also asked about her relationship with Smyer. She stated that when they met, he told her that he had only one child, when the truth was he had two. She described him as being frustrated often when he was made to buy diapers and other necessities for his child. Early on in their relationship, when they first started dating, Smyer was the one to first bring up the subject of birth control. He insisted that she get on it and stay on it. Again, it kind of, at least for me, points to Derek Smyer's pattern of not wanting the responsibility of protecting himself. Either he doesn't want to, or he doesn't want to bother with it. He prefers intercourse without it, or he wants his partner to be the one to take responsibility for having and keeping herself on birth control, which is fine. But if she doesn't want to, then of course she should be open and honest about that. And he has to decide if he's going to take the precautions, or if he's going to take the chance, or if he's just not even going to go there. But we've heard Smyer to have called Crystal a gold digger. She was having the baby and going after his money. Are there women that do that? Sure there are. It happens. And that's where men need to, again, be cautious and protect themselves. How does Smyer know if a woman is telling him that she's on birth control that she's being truthful? People play these games, and it goes both ways. Both men and women do it. I can't say what was going on with Crystal because I don't know. There is a little more to the story when it comes to her and all this, but it is clear that Derek Smyer is playing a very serious game with all of these women that he becomes involved with. But anyway, RV also said that when she dated him, she almost always had to pay for herself, and that included when they took a vacation cruise together. She paid for all of her own travel expenses, which also is perfectly fine. I personally don't think men should be expected to pay for everything. But I do think that the one who asks the other person out on the date, the one who does the inviting, should be the one to pay. And that goes both ways too. Though I'll admit, I do think it is very sweet and very charming when a man is a gentleman, when he asks a woman out because he enjoys her company, and when they go out, it's very nice when he insists on paying. However, it is equally as sweet and charming for her to do the same from time to time. RV also discussed a conversation they once had that was an intense moment where they were professing their love for each other. And in that moment, he posed this question: would she kill for him? At the time, she thought it was a strange question to ask. And I agree, it's a very bizarre question. But coming from Smyer, somehow it's not all that surprising. She told him yes, but wanted to quickly move on and didn't want to pursue that conversation any further. Later on down the line in this case, Smyer would take issue with some of the things that RV had to say about him because, quote, her testimony paints him as a man who used women. He did not want the women that he dated to get pregnant, that he committed crimes, that he complained about supporting his children, all the while he himself drove a convertible Mustang, unquote. Sounds about right to me. But anyway, Smyer served 14 months in federal prison for his bank fraud conviction. Detective Williams heard about this conviction that Smyer racked up in 2004, some 3 years or so after Crystal's murder. And it was no surprise to him that Smyer found himself in this kind of trouble, and even less surprising was the fact that he manipulated and used yet another girlfriend to commit the crime, because that is the way that Derek Smyer operates. It is always about what everyone can do to benefit him, no matter who gets hurt or who loses, so long as Derek Smyer wins. Detective Williams called Smyer all the things that we've been calling him throughout this story: manipulative, self-centered, arrogant. That is Derek Smyer in a nutshell. All this that we are learning about Smyer, all it does is continue to fly in the face of how his sister, his staunchest defender, how she portrays him and everything that she has to say about him. And again, I can't help but feel all those asterisks next to everything that she has to say about him. She has said he got his bachelor's degree in business and got a great job. And here's the asterisk. But he squandered all of that by committing bank fraud and serving 14 months in prison, and pretty much ensured that he would never be able to work in any capacity involving banking again, and likely many, many other lines of work because of his conviction. She has said that he started his own business. Another asterisk. He started his own business because he had no choice due to him being unable to pass a background check to get into working in corporate America anymore. Just about the only thing Danielle Smyer has said that rang true was the time that she said, "My brother is not a perfect man." No asterisk there. That's the realest thing that she's had to say about him. And I can see that she has this passion for him. But I'm sorry, but she's been bamboozled just like all the other women in Smyer's life. Okay, dreamers, it looks like I'm going to have to break this down into 3 parts because there is still so much more to cover here. And I don't want to rush through this, and I feel myself doing that right now. So I'm going to pause this here, and we will wrap this case up in one final part 3, coming soon to your podcatcher. I want to thank you again so much for listening. I will be back shortly with the conclusion to our story. Until then, sweet dreams.